Welcome to Module 6, Lecture 5. In this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about the limits of science. So we've been talking this whole course about how taking a naturalistic perspective, taking methodological naturalism as our starting point can be a really helpful way to look at religion. So you can learn things about religion from a scientific perspective that you can't see when you're standing inside, when you're looking at it as a religious insider. But in this final lecture, what I want to talk about is the limits of science. And not just from a theological perspective. So theologians and religious believers talk about the limits of science all the time. But more importantly, I think, and actually more significantly for human beings, there are scientific reasons for thinking there are limits to science. So from the scientific perspective itself, we can see how the scientific worldview is unsatisfying and in some ways alien to human psychology in important ways. And this is a point that I think has been missed in some of the rhetoric around the new atheism and the role of religion in science in the world, is that there are scientific reasons for thinking that at a certain level human beings can't fully embrace the scientific perspective. The limits of the scientific worldview also help us to understand the limits of secularism. So there was an idea that's very prominent in the 60s and 70s that as human beings, so there's good evidence that as people get wealthier, as we've seen, they become less religious. So there's this idea as people became wealthier and more educated, religion would kind of die out. So we'd see this decline in religion. And this just is empirically not what we see. Religion is, anyone who looks at a newspaper, you can realize that religion's still front and center in human affairs. It's not just because people aren't educated enough or wealthy enough. It's, I would argue, because religious cognition plays an essential part in human psychology, in the economy of human psychology. So there's at least two ways in which this is true. The first has to do with questions of why. Science can answer how. So science can answer questions about how things work. Science can't answer why. And in fact, from a scientific perspective, that question makes no sense. There is no why. Things just happen. There's no reason, there's no guiding intelligence, there's no teleology, there's no goal that things are tending towards. Things just happen. So the why question itself makes no sense from a scientific perspective. And yet, human beings constantly ask why. So we've talked about in Module 3 about promiscuous teleology and theory of mind. So the idea that people project intentionality onto the world and seem to be unable to help doing this. We see reasons in the world, even though objectively we can stand back and realize there are no reasons. The projection of teleology, the asking of why questions that seems to be so woven into human psychology, is one of the limits of the scientific worldview. We are going to ask why. So it just seems to be the case that people find explanations that don't include a why element, some kind of intentional element, unsatisfying. We feel like the explanation is not complete unless we have a reason why. This is what Robert Macaulay means. He has an important monograph called Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not. And really the take-home message is that the scientific stance, so withdrawing intentionality from the world and seeing it in a mechanistic way, so seeing it as causes happening for no reason, is unnatural. It's really hard to do, and it's easy for people to slip out of it. It's not our natural way of thinking. So Deb Kellerman, who did the important work on promiscuous teleology, finds that not only children around the world spontaneously give teleological reasons for why things are. They have intentional explanations. What she found in some more recent work that's very interesting is that even professional scientists, if you put them under time pressure, this is important. So if you speed them up, they will revert to intentional explanations for why things happen, not the proper scientific explanation. So when you speed people up, you put them under time pressure, you're seeing what their hot cognition or what their natural cognition is like. So even professional scientists do this. In another important line of research, Bethany Haywood and Jesse Bering find that subjects, even atheists, so people who are atheists, they completely embrace the scientific perspective, scientific worldview, are still attracted to thinking that things happen for a reason. They're still tempted to say that they met their spouse for a reason. The reason they bumped into them at the cafe at this particular time was meant to be. So they use language like happened for a reason, meant to be. And if you quiz them on it, they'll say, well, yeah, I guess that doesn't make any sense. but we still like it, we're still attracted to it. And this is my experience. So I'm an atheist. I fully embrace the naturalistic worldview, and yet I still think things happen for a reason, despite the fact that I know they don't. I still have superstitions that don't make any sense unless I'm projecting at some level intentionality onto the world. So I knock on wood. If I say, it's great that my daughter hasn't gotten sick in a while, actually right now I'm going to knock on wood because I said that. And it's funny, my daughter asked me why I knock on wood, and I realize I do it. If I analyze it, I think what's going on is it's a kind of projection of social agency, social cognition onto the universe. I feel like if things are going well and I brag about it or I point it out, the universe might get annoyed with me and take that good thing away. I think that's got to be what's going on. And of course, that makes no sense. There's no universe that's going to get mad at me, and yet it's a very powerful feeling, and I feel deeply uncomfortable if I don't knock on wood when I say something like that. So this shows that even among people who I have a very carefully thought out, I have very good reasons why I embrace the scientific worldview, I still can't escape the gravitational pull of intentionality of why questions. And again, this shows one of the limits of the scientific worldview. We're always going to think in these quasi-religious terms. So the first reason there are limits to the scientific worldview is this failure to answer the why question that we seem compelled to ask as human beings, even though at a certain level it makes no sense. The second limit to science is that it doesn't answer ought questions. What should we do? What's the right thing to do? What's the good thing to do? Now, there's this famous distinction in philosophy between is and ought. So the claim is, well, science can tell us about what is, it can't tell us what ought to be, what are the normative values we should have. I think there's a degree to which this distinction is sometimes overblown. So I'm part of a movement in philosophy arguing that what we know about is questions, so what we know about human psychology should actually play a role in our ought formulations. If we have a model of ethics that radically contradicts what we know about how human psychology works, that should be a problem. That should make us revise our ought in certain ways. And yet there's something to this distinction in the sense that what we know about facts of the world, radically underdetermine oughts. So what we know about the world does not tell us what we should do. Values don't emerge in any obvious way from facts. And again, this is one of the distinctions I think that some of the people involved in the new atheist movement don't see clearly, is that what we know about human psychology, what we know about the way the world works, still radically underdetermines the set of values that we might embrace. And what I mean by radically underdetermines is that there's no clear, obvious way in which the things we know about the world allows us to jump to claims about what we ought to do. There's no clear relationship between the two. The set of values that we embrace often has very little to do with what we know about the world. And that doesn't seem to be just an accident. It seems to be the way values work. This is where I think the work of Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor is so important. So Taylor's claim is that he talks about what he calls strong evaluation. So a weak evaluation is just a preference. So I prefer vanilla ice cream to strawberry ice cream. Strong evaluations are different. So strong evaluations are things like, I think slavery is wrong. I think oppression of women is wrong. These are different because we want to impose them on people. If I think slavery is wrong, I don't say, well, if you like slavery, go ahead and do it. I want everyone to conform to my view, my preference on this front. It tends to arouse emotions. It tends to be intolerant, so we want to impose these things on others. So strong evaluation is really his term for moral evaluation. This is the difference between a moral judgment and a non-moral judgment. Now, Taylor's claim is that the reason strong evaluations have their strength, what gives them their force, is that they're connected to claims about the universe. They're connected to what he calls ontological claims, so claims about what is real, and what is real in the sense of things we can't see that are real. We could also think of this as a metaphysical claim. So strong evaluations get their justification from these claims about the nature of the universe, and claims that are by their very nature unverifiable. They're not subject to empirical verification. Taylor also argues that making strong valuations, and making these kind of evaluations that are tied to metaphysical claims, is part of what he calls the transcendental condition of being human. We can't be a psychologically normal human and not make these kind of claims or be committed or drawn to these kind of claims. And here I would give you a naturalistic spin on Taylor, not necessarily a transcendental condition of being human in some kind of metaphysical way. I think it's just built into human psychology. It seems to be the case that we make these kind of norm claims and we're drawn to these kind of norm claims, and they're just because they feel so strong to us. I would actually spin Taylor's causality around. So his claim is that the reason strong evaluations are so strong is because they come from the metaphysical. In my view, the strong part comes first. And here I'm relying on people like Jonathan Haidt and other moral psychologists who suggest that our moral claims come from our emotions. They come from gut reactions. And what happens, in my view, is that when these gut reactions are so strong, we want to impose them on others. We don't think they're a personal preference. We think they're universalizable. And therefore, we are motivated to tell stories where they're connected to some kind of feature of the universe. So I think the metaphysical is actually piggybacking. It's a kind of explanation to ourselves and to others about why we feel so strongly about these moral norms. But in any case, human beings seem to do this naturally. And Taylor's claim, the very controversial claim, is that even secular ethics, so when you look at people who are trying to construct an ethics that's completely free of religion, so the Enlightenment philosophers were trying to do this, we're just going to base ethics in facts, what we know about the world, facts and human rationality. Taylor's claim is that that's not really what's going on. If you scratch the surface of Enlightenment philosophy, secular philosophy, you see metaphysical entities everywhere, lurking in the distance. He's a very good historian. It tells the genealogy of really how Enlightenment ethics come from Christianity, and gradually the theological elements get stripped out. So we stop talking about God in a personalized form. But the structure is basically the same. And so his argument is that concepts like human rights or human dignity, we talk about these things. We say, well, it violates human rights. Is that a scientific concept where you can't x-ray someone and see their human rights? You can't do an fMRI and see human rights. Human rights is a metaphysical belief. It has to do with a concept of the person that it probably comes out of basic human cognition, but in the case of Europe, comes out of the Christian tradition. And this gives us the normative force, right? Why do we go in and intervene in countries where people are being oppressed? Well, because their human dignity, their human rights are being violated. And so Taylor's point is that there's no escaping metaphysical claims. If we're going to make normative claims, which we are going to do as human beings, we're inevitably going to be entangled in at least a certain number of metaphysical claims. And this is very controversial because secular people, Enlightenment, modern philosophers who want to get past religion, new atheists, think they can ground ethics purely in facts. And Taylor's claiming that they're deluded about this, that they're missing an important feature of human cognition. And I think he's right about this. So for instance, Sam Harris, one of these new atheists, thinks we can have a rational ethic based on utilitarianism. And what we're going to try to do is just minimize suffering. So suffering is bad, and so if we have a way of calculating what's involved in various types of behavior and how much suffering they cause, we can just figure things out objectively by minimizing suffering. The number of problems with this view is really, it's hard to know where to start. I mean, first of all, the idea that we can find a common currency for suffering, psychological suffering, physical suffering, are they all the same kind of suffering, I think is a basic kind of mistake that utilitarians make, that there's some kind of basic currency we could reduce all of the goods in the world to. I think that actually goods are incommensurable in various ways. But the bigger issue lurking in the background here that I just don't think people like Sam Harris see is the idea that suffering is bad is a type of value. It's a contingent type of commitment. There are a lot of worldviews where suffering is not the worst thing in the world. Suffering in Christian context, suffering for the glory of God is a wonderful thing. It's actually suffering ennobles you. It makes you good. The idea that suffering is bad is actually part of a particular worldview, and Charles Taylor analyzes this beautifully, calls it the affirmation of ordinary life. So it's a worldview that arises in Europe at a certain period where people get this idea that the life of production, that the life, everyday life, so the family life, eating well, having a comfortable place to live, that there's something normatively positive about that. There's something we should value about that. The reason it's a particular worldview is it's very different from some previous worldviews. Nietzsche saw the affirmation of ordinary life developing in Europe, and it horrified him. He thought this was slave morality. So this is how slaves think. Real men, people who have some honor and some nobility, know that suffering is great. Suffering makes you strong. So the idea that suffering itself is bad is itself a value, and you don't have to go very far to find people who don't share that value. value. So this is the point, is that we seem to be always trapped in some sort of value judgment. And there's no way that science is going to pop us out of it magically and put us into a neutral spot where we can just objectively determine what the right thing to do is. So this is a very important sense in which there's another limit to science when it comes to normative values. And normative values seem to be inextricably tied up with religion, with metaphysical claims about the universe that we can't verify. One of the other things Taylor points out about the quirks of the modern secular worldview is that it's got a kind of contradiction built into it. So one of our values is diversity. We like diversity. We want to value other people's values. And yet we've got certain values that are strong evaluations, and those two things are in conflict. My favorite illustration of this is when I became a Canadian citizen, I was given a booklet to study about Canadian values so I could understand what it means to be a Canadian. And on one of the pages, the page was mostly dedicated to Canadian multiculturalism. And the implicit message was, we're not the United States. So the US is a melting pot, everyone has to become the same. Canada's different, we're a rainbow. We want you to come and keep your culture. We believe in multiculturalism. We can all dwell with our rich cultures side by side and no one has to give up their culture. But then there's a little box that said, oh, but by the way, here's a bunch of stuff you can't do. So in other words, here's a bunch of stuff from if this is part of your culture, that you can't bring with you. You can't oppress women, you can't engage in honor killings. There's a whole bunch of things you can't do if you want to come to Canada. And that's a good example of this tension. We value diversity, we want to let people have their own cultures up to a limit. And that limit is defined by our set of these deep commitments, these strong evaluations that we're committed to. So this is a controversial view. Taylor's views are very controversial in philosophical circles. Bringing up Taylor is the easiest way to get a bunch of new atheists riled. So if you want, actually, as part of our bonus footage, we have some clips from a conference called Beyond Belief, where I was defending Taylor's views in a hornet's nest of new atheists. And you can see, especially in the Q&A, how opposed to this, there is a debate in philosophical circles about this, but I think how angry people get about this view is actually revealing. It shows that people's values are being questioned in a way they really don't like. So in my view, the take-home message is, as much as we want to be scientific, and we should be scientific, we learn a lot about the world being scientific, we don't want to be scientistic, so we don't want to take science itself as the answers to all of our questions. Science might be the answer to all of our questions intellectually in an abstract sense, but because of the way human beings are built, because of our innate psychology, there's going to be aspects of our experience that just can't be captured by scientific explanation. And this is why religion will never go away. I think one of the crucial reasons for understanding religion scientifically is understanding that it's not going to go away. It's actually built into human psychology, and therefore it's quite an urgent matter to understand it. I think when we had this idea that religion was going to fade away as we became wealthier and better educated, you can see why studying religion wouldn't be that interesting. Why would you want to study this medieval thing that's going to disappear? If you think that religion is actually part of human cognition, it's built into human cognition, it's not going to go away. At very least, it's going to remain in this kind of, you want to call it metaphysically minimalist way you see it in secular ethics, but it's going to be around. You're going to be much more motivated to understand how it works, what the mechanisms of religious cognition are, what the evolutionary roots of it are, and how religion is connected to things like group identity and intergroup violence. So that brings us to the end of Module 6, and I hope this lecture has given you some perspective on the course as a whole, so why it's important to study religion from a scientific perspective, but also what the potential limits of the scientific worldview might be.